I won't go into a big map of how the Israeli Ministry of Welfare and Social Services works, but I belong to a parallel wing of the Welfare Ministry to Aline, who spoke earlier. We do very similar things, and we do different things, but this is just the way that the Welfare Ministry is being reorganized all the time, like most of public government, I think, all around the world. I belong to Children and Family Services, and for several years now we have run treatment centers for children who've been sexually abused. Some of you, very few of you, were here 2 years ago, and I presented the model and how we reached the model. And the idea is that we have in every region of the country, we have a regional center which specializes in giving very accessible therapy for children who've been abused. And the idea of a regional model was that we could have the staff setting together in one setting, getting close supervision, personal supervision, group supervision, being under a professional director who was an expert in treatment of child sexual abuse. That way, the idea was that we could, first of all, maintain the professional standards of the service, and also we could make sure that the staff weren't burning out, that they were being properly supervised, and also having mutual support, which meant that we hopefully would retain the staff for longer and they wouldn't all crash out on us with secondary traumatization. So we now have regional centers all around the country. They're all operated by NGOs. I don't know how many of you know Israel has privatized a lot of its social services. We have very good NGOs that work with us, but it's under public tenders and NGOs that professionally are dealing with children who've been abused. Most of them are professional organizations. And of course, ministry supervision, and everybody works under the same organizational model. We have 13 centers that have been running for between 3 and 8 years. And we are in the process of opening 2 more new centers in the center of the country. This is a very interesting project. It was started outside the welfare ministry, and it went periphery into the center of the country, which means that the peripheral services have been developed a long time, which for any of the people here living in the far north, we know that getting professional treatment services in the farther distant parts of the country is much more difficult. So the whole project went periphery and into the center of the country. So we now have 15 centers operational, and by the end of the year, we're opening another 4. We have the NGOs already, and they're now working hard to get the services opened. Why is this important? Because at this time, I thought it was important that we did some work on what are we doing in the centers, what are we all doing, what do we agree on, what do we all think are the paramount things that every center should be doing, and laying down the parameters for the service, partly so that we could pool the knowledge that we have, and the second reason is that we wanted to pass the knowledge on to the new centers that were being set up. As you can see, we're giving emotional therapy to CSA victims from the age of 3 up until the age of 19. 19 is because, we want to make sure that kids finish high school. They don't always finish on the last day of their 18th birthday. They usually don't, so that carries on. And the other thing the centers do is they're a community resource. They act as a community service for giving advice. Sometimes we have families and parents phoning up. We have a lot of professionals phoning up to get advice, how to approach a case, what's the best way to talk to the family, what's the best way to see the abuse that they are worried that is going on. And part of the center's job is to provide training and publicity around knowledge regarding sexual abuse, child sexual abuse in the area that they are in charge of. So this means that we have a community resource and not just a therapy center which looks a little bit like a therapeutic clinic. Just one more word about the general policy. I think the ultimate policy statement is that we couldn't prevent the children being abused, but we certainly, as a state, have decided to provide free, accessible emotional therapy for children that have been abused. The referrals are made by the Social Services Department. I will get back to that in a minute because I think it's an important part of the plan that's been set up. The service, however, is universal, which means that people can come to the Social Services Department and open a file in order to get free, accessible professional treatment for their child who's been sexually abused, even if they had absolutely no contact with social services beforehand. The service is totally free. There are large debates on whether it should be totally free, whether there should be a little, kind of money box in the entrance, and people should feel that they could donate something. I'm not going to go into that today, but basically it's free, and therapy in this country is expensive, so free is a lot of money for families. And we treat all sorts of child sexual abuse in the family, out of the family, with or without criminal proceedings. What Aline spoke to you about before the break was cases which have been reported. We have mandatory reporting for most sexual offences, certainly sexual offences within the family or within frameworks where an adult was meant to be in charge of the child. So those reports usually go to a child protection officer in the social services department. A few of them go directly to the police, not usually a choice of call for most families. And the social services department, the child protection officer, basically decides whether the case goes to the police or whether she asks for an exemption from going to the police. We have a special committee, it's an Israeli invention, which allows social services to present a plan of treatment and get exemption from going to the police, usually temporary exemption. There's the family start treatment, we see the way things are going, and then there can be a full exemption from police involvement further along down the line. I think this was kind of an Israeli way of wanting to have compulsory reporting and mandatory reporting that a lot of countries have, but a way of allowing us some sort of flexibility in the cases that we are fairly sure that the children are protected and that we can choose a therapeutic route. So the reason I was saying all this is because in the centres we're seeing a whole range of children from, I won't say the simplest kind of abuse, it sounds awful, nobody take offense, but we have children who've been abused one time, usually by somebody known to them, because we all know that 97% of children are abused by somebody known to them, but something that happened, not necessarily very extensive, not necessarily very traumatic, and up to obviously children that have been abused over many years by close family members within the home. We're seeing the whole range, and we have children that they have criminal proceedings going on in the background, and an awful lot that don't. Actually, the most worrying thing that we have at the moment is the gap between the inside of the therapy room, where the children are feeling very, very recognized, heard. The fact that they've been abused is very much on the table, and the pretty much lack of criminal proceedings going on outside the room is something that we're feeling that gap is widening the whole time. I think it's something that you were hearing about a bit earlier this morning. So, sorry, that's the wrong way. Just so that you know, we're seeing between 17 and 1,800 children a year in the centres, and we're still seeing another 500 or 600 children with private therapists, and hopefully by the time we've set up the rest of the centres by the end of this year, in terms of public services, we will be seeing, I would imagine, between 2,300, 2,400 children a year. We have the capacity, and unfortunately if we have more demand, then we will be able to expand the service. Just to kind of help out, child protection services in 2017, we haven't finished counting 2018, there were about 6,000 referrals of suspected child sexual abuse. So if we're seeing 2,500 of those in direct therapy, you could ask where the others are. Some of the parents will take their children to private therapy. Some of the children will be removed from home and be getting therapy in out-of-home settings. And I still think we have a lot of more work to do to make sure that we're getting, as Aline said, to the last of the children that has been investigated, that we're worried that they've been abused and that they're getting the right sort of therapy. And we count hours, so we have a lot of hours. The main reason all this is relevant is that we've accrued an awful lot of knowledge. And what we wanted to do this year is we set up a study group. All the centre directors, who are all professional therapists themselves, experts in child sexual abuse, all took part, and we had ministry representatives as well. And the idea was that we should pool our knowledge. Everybody would say what they have been doing in their centre, what they feel has been working best. We've seen several thousand children over the last few years, so the idea was really, this is a great research group. We also decided that we had to try, this was more me as the policymaker, of course, and the person in charge of public money. The idea was that we should try and agree on the professional parameters that that we're all abiding by when we provide the service. What are the things that we all do and we all think are important that every centre and every therapist in the centre should be doing? Obviously trying to bring it into a policy document that is pretty much almost ready, and then we will be able to use that for the new centres and for ourselves. And hopefully one day we will be able to do some massive research project. I'm looking at Rachel, but I need the ministry for this. Because I think what we'd really like to do is drive down into the functioning of the centres and see what really works. And we have at the moment a huge range of therapy techniques going on in the actual therapy rooms. So I'm talking about the organizational framework and not just what goes on in the therapy room one-on-one with the child or with the parents. The group was led by an informational scientist. This is a kind of model that we use quite a lot in the welfare ministry. We have an informational scientist who doesn't have a therapeutic background, although she's worked with welfare settings quite a lot. And she's an absolute expert at digging out the information that is available within the group, actually making sure that the people bring their information into the room and writing it up and organizing it. And as I said, these were the people that took part, mainly the center directors. We came up with a sort of scheme of what we're all doing. This is kind of just a diagram of what we're all doing, with basically the background to all the referrals is some sort of sexual abuse of the child. I'm talking from top down. Every center has its mandate and boundaries that we try to drill down and define them in more detail. We all do collection of referral data and assessment, initial assessment. Obviously, we all, at that point, we'll build a program of therapy. We'll go out into the process of therapy, and then we will be doing some sort of assessment of progress, which is a kind of assessment going back to the therapy program, reassessing, and then obviously at the end, finishing the intervention. We quite often will invite children to come back in the future. I think this, I'm just, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. Referral, obviously, and the end of therapy. Guiding principles of intervention was what we decided to try and see what are the absolute bottom red lines that all the centres abide by. They didn't mean to, but in the end, we actually all agreed on lots of things that we all think are absolute musts within this therapy setting. One of them, of course, is cooperation and joint interventions with the social services department. I come from a child protection background, and this whole service was set up originally from a child protection perspective. And I think nobody thought that children who've been sexually abused shouldn't at least be assessed in the eyes of a social services assessment to make sure they're protected, to make sure that we don't miss the cases that need to be removed from home, to make sure that the children who stay at home can be in therapy once or twice a week and that is enough for them, to make sure that we are continually assessing the safety of those children when they are at home with sexual abuse in their background. So I see this as very much as an extension service of a local social services department. And interestingly enough, that was what I started to say, we all agreed that the overall goal of the centres was restoring the child to a path of normal development, a normal child development, which I think is interesting because when I first came to the office, I was very scared because I never thought I was a child protection officer. I didn't think I was a great expert in child sexual abuse. Lots of cases where I, over the years, have realized I missed, I didn't listen well enough, I didn't protect enough, or I didn't hear enough. And I'm not ignoring the child sexual abuse, but it's interesting when we all sat around the table together, we all agreed that, first of all, the child was a child and the child needed to, as far as possible, be able to be restored, to go back to his normal life of being a child. Even if he's been sexually abused, this is something that happens in life, can happen in life, shouldn't happen in life. But again, the child has its developmental goals and paths that he has to get back on. And we actually decided that it was the thing that we all, the therapists, really hung on to. And if you didn't hang on to that, then the therapy didn't go anywhere. If you only saw sexual abuse, if you only saw abuse of the body, if you only saw sexual images, if you only saw orifices, I'm sorry I'm doing this, but all you art therapists and drama therapists will, but if we only see the child as a body who's been abused, we are likely to miss seeing the child as a child. I'm not putting one on top of the other, I'm just stating it was fascinating that was the thing, this green arrow in the middle was agreed by absolutely everybody. There was a lot of debating around the room, and there was a lot of, but I think, to me, it was fascinating. I don't know about you. So certainly the main conclusion was that the mandate of the centre is to provide therapy to children and youth who've been sexually abused, and that the focus should be on understanding and processing the repercussions and implication of the sexual abuse for the child and the family. Obviously, we all know that sexual abuse needs to be treated because of all the knock-on effects, all the damage that it does, and all the damage that it does to the way the children function in life and the way they see the world and the way their parents see the world. Providing interventions that also relate not just to the abuse itself, but to the substrate. I don't know if that's the right word, you can help me out on this one, but we tried to kind of drill down into the children that we all know and recognize that something wasn't really strong there beforehand, and then they got abused. And I'm not saying it, in a blaming, so it's just, this is what we're seeing in the centres. We're seeing children who came with emotional difficulties, who came from weaker home backgrounds, who came from neglect, who came from a slightly lower self-esteem, and some of these things are very, very present when we come to assess the effect of the sexual abuse on the children. So we do need to relate to the substrate, and we do need to relate, obviously, to things that are to do with the functioning of the individual child and of the family. So the centres are always seeing family members as well as the children. We're not giving up on the family. And the other thing that we all certainly agreed on was that we did need to process the sexual abuse itself. We're not ignoring the sexual abuse, far from it. We're talking clearly about it, either directly or projectively, depending on the ability of the child, and certainly not forcing a child who doesn't want to talk physically about his body, because he will talk about it in different ways. And we have a lot of art therapists and psychotherapists, and we have a whole selection of different treatment, different members of staff. And obviously prevention of recurrence, which includes giving psychosocial education, giving education about sexuality, sexual health, sexual values in the family, all the things that we all know about. So these were three absolute axioms of function within the centres. As I said, this was interesting, but this was the overall goal that we all agreed on, was restoring the child to the path of normal development. To this end, we quite often say that a child will come to us, maybe they'll have a year of therapy, and if they come back to us in another 2 or 3 years, it's not a failure. This is like process of bereavement. We know that what children understand about bereavement when they're 7 or 8, when they're 10 or 11 or 12, they understand differently. And it's the same, to my mind, with sexual abuse. So when a child is 8 or 9 and they have had therapy, then when they're 11 or 12, they will suddenly possibly wake up in the night and say, oh God, is that what happened to me? And then they will come back to us. And as far as I'm concerned, they can come back 2 or 3 or 4 times. That doesn't mean to say we didn't do the job right the first time. That means that we see the child as a developing organism that needs different input at different ages. So as I said, we all agreed this was the guiding light. And it also means that it requires our therapists to be professionals who know how to deal with child and parent therapy, sexual abuse, trauma, family interventions. We have quite a long list, quite a long shopping list when we recruit therapists. Sigalit is sitting here, who's in charge of our therapist training courses, and we're very strict about who we allowed in, but we do feel that if the centres are going to be expert, then this has to be the expertise that we're looking for. The other thing we did was we tried to lay down the trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive parts of the service that we all agreed on, talking about confidentiality, obviously fulfilling all legal requirements, accompanying the children who are in legal processes, going with them to court, preparing them for any kind of court intervention, asking about the criminal procedure, which either is or isn't taking place outside the room, not just talking in the room and leaving the outside world outside. We're certainly bringing the outside world into the therapy room, talking clearly about the fact that we're here because the child has been sexually abused. If that isn't in agreement with everybody, we have difficulty starting therapy in a centre where the headline of the centre, the title, the sign on the door is a centre for children who've been sexually abused. Giving information, as we said, about child sexuality, sexual abuse, trauma, making sure that families know what these things look like and what can be expected. Retaining a certain sort of flexibility when we're dealing with the family and with the child. Working with support systems. Obviously, we do a lot of holistic elements within the treatment. Here comes the connection with the social services department, with the schools, with maybe the legal attorney who's accompanying the child in the legal process, trying to keep the whole circle of people surrounding the child in line with what's going on in the therapy. As far as possible, allowing choice and allowing flexibility to the family. Maintaining a constant setting, trying not to cancel, trying not to move things around too much. And anything that will help the child and the parents realize that the world usually acts normally. It didn't in the case of the abuse, but it usually acts normally, and we're going to try and recreate that as much as possible. And obviously the supervision that our therapists require is just huge, and we thankfully have the resources to give them that at the moment. The other thing that we really all agreed on was that the therapist has to be a source of hope and a belief that there's post-traumatic growth, particularly in children. And I think this is part of what's at the base of all our work, is that we do believe that children can grow, can change, can carry on. I remember the first time as a child protection officer that I went to meet a child who had been abused at school. And somebody just before I went said, just remember, tell the parents there's life after the abuse. And I think after that, my child protection work with children who'd been sexually abused went up a rung, because I think, you know, unless you've got that sort of belief in your pocket, it's very difficult to go and meet parents or children who've been sexually abused. And I do believe that this hope and belief is very important. I don't know how much time I've got, Rachel. This is the end, isn't it? Ah, okay. We tried to, I mean, Rachel asked us to put more emphasis on the assessment, so we did go more deeply down into the assessment process that we do. Firstly, initially when a child is referred, and also later on when we're trying to reassess where have we got to, what have we achieved, where else have we got to go with the child and with the family. And I think what we all agreed was that the assessment process should look at the repercussions of the sexual abuse on the child and on the family, that it should look at the repercussions which could be physical, emotional, cognitive, or behavioral, and. I mean, we should look at all aspects of the child and see where the sexual abuse is appearing in these different parts of the child. Obviously, the sexual abuse quite often is an expression of dynamics within the family, and this can be a strength, and this can also be part of the therapy that we're going to have to deal with. And what we said before about the fact that we have children with individual strengths, individual abilities, we want to use these strengths and abilities so that the children can use therapy in the most effective way possible. So we're talking about collecting information that relates to all of those themes that I mentioned on the previous slide. Family dynamics, it has to include here at the bottom how the family relates in general to sexuality, how the family copes with trauma, how the family sees trauma, sees sex, sees sexuality in general, sees children's sexuality. We can't ignore those things. And I think the other thing that we need to look at is what do the child and the parents see as the main focus of the trauma today? And we start there, and we might discover together all sorts of other things, but I think we need to start where the parents and the children are feeling that at the moment, this is the thing which is absolutely hitting them, and this is the place where they're absolutely not managing to function, or not waking up in the middle of the night, or whatever.